two different conditions. You've got type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. But what they have in common is a problem with sugar. By this I mean that the people's blood glucose, glucose being a type of sugar, is raised in both types of diabetes. And this is because of a problem with insulin. Now, insulin is a hormone, and insulin's job is to get rid of the sugar in your blood. And what insulin actually does is it pushes that sugar into your muscles for energy, into your belly where it gets turned into fat, or into your liver where it can be turned into fat. So, number one, if you don't have insulin, say if the gland that produces insulin, called the pancreas gland, if that packs up for whatever reason, you don't produce insulin, that's very dangerous, and your blood sugar levels will go up because the insulin is no longer produced and no longer getting rid of the sugar as it should. And that's called type 1 diabetes. So people with type 1 diabetes don't produce insulin, and so they're vulnerable because those blood sugar levels go sky high and they can't access the sugar for energy. So actually for them, insulin is a life-saving treatment. But then there's another problem. Type 2 diabetes is a related but very different condition. Their problem is that the insulin doesn't work as well anymore. So the insulin doesn't work as well, so it's not pushing that sugar out of the bloodstream into the muscles for energy, into your belly for reserves, but you become fat, and your liver. So that people with type 2 diabetes are getting a high blood glucose because the insulin isn't pushing that sugar away and tidying it up as it ought to. If you've got type 1 diabetes, they're not producing insulin. Then you've got type 2 diabetes where the insulin is produced, but it's not working properly. And in fact, you're said to become insulin resistant, so that the insulin, you have to produce more and more insulin for the same effect as type 2 diabetes gets worse. So that for me is the major difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Insulin's a hormone. Our bodies are controlled by various hormones. There are other ones like testosterone. Another one would be thyroxine. Hormones control chemical reactions in your body. Insulin is produced by the pancreas gland, and the job of insulin is to deal with sugar. So that if you consume sugar, you digest it, it's absorbed into your bloodstream. The blood sugar therefore goes high, and it's necessary for that sugar to be got rid of. So insulin pushes sugar into your muscles for energy, into your belly fat as a reserve of energy for later, and into the liver. So that very rapidly insulin brings down blood glucose, and if it didn't, you'd be very ill. It does damage in very many ways. Unfortunately, sugars can attach to proteins in an irreversible way. So high blood glucose, one of the worst things it does is damage the microcirculation. And the microcirculation, the tiny blood vessels that supply your eyes and your kidneys and parts of your brain. So that's why if we don't look after people with diabetes and they have a high blood glucose, over time they get damage to the tiny blood vessels that supply vital organs. But high blood glucose does damage in other ways. Over time, you also develop changes in the blood fats, the blood lipids. And so high blood glucose over time affects your cholesterol and your triglyceride. These are the fats that run in the body, and they start to affect the large blood vessels. So the small blood vessels are affected almost immediately directly by glucose, and as I understand it, the large blood vessels are damaged in a secondary way via these cholesterol and triglyceride-like compounds which go out of control for many people with poorly controlled diabetes. And there are other things as well as a third thing, and that is particularly for type 2 diabetes. Part of the reason that people have type 2 diabetes is being overweight, particularly if they carry central obesity, so that's more belly fat. And we know that people with more belly fat are at risk of all sorts of diseases. And in fact, it's cancer research just recently have been asking us all, what is the second most common cause of cancer after smoking? And in fact, the second most common cause of cancer is obesity. And there is definitely a link between diabetes and cancer. So it can be seen that actually diabetes is quite dangerous in a number of ways, and that controlling diabetes well, type 1 or type 2, is very important for long-term health. You can think of it a bit like a bank account in a way. So just like your bank account, money goes in and money comes out. So just like blood glucose, if we think about insulin, insulin is in charge of draining the bank account, of getting rid of the sugar out of your blood. But obviously the question is, well, where does it come from in the first place? And that's, for me, diet. So where does the glucose come? So if you have more sugar in your diet, then inevitably you're going to absorb it, and it'll appear in the bloodstream. And if you have a diet with a lot of sugar in, then that's going to add to your bank account of sugar and give insulin a much harder job to do. I think one of the questions I'm often asked is people with type 2 diabetes say, well, it's obvious I gave up sugar years ago. They don't understand. They wonder, well, why are my blood glucose so high? Why is it so high when I don't eat sugar? And I think what so many of us fail to understand is that actually starchy carbohydrates are made up of sugar. The actual building block of starch is glucose. So if you eat bread or you eat rice or you eat potatoes, which are starchy carbohydrates, the very action of digestion breaks them down back into that glucose, which is rapidly absorbed, adding to your problem. There is a third way in which you can get glucose as well, as not many people think about, but stress. So the action of, if you're very anxious, if you're very stressed or you're ill, then your body can actually generate sugar from your fat reserves and your protein reserves, and you have some small reserves of sugar. So in a time of need, those reserves can be liquidated to produce sugar. And I've seen patients who haven't eaten a lot of sugar and aren't having a lot of starchy carbs, whose blood glucose is high, and maybe they've just done something very stressful or they're actually ill. Those are the three main causes. It's interesting. I came across this personally because for a while I wore a continuous glucose monitor on my arm. So it told me all the time how high my blood glucose was. And I find that public speaking, probably now, just because I'm chatting on camera, that will very likely double my blood glucose. And that happened for the first time in a TV thing I was doing. I was horrified to find my blood glucose climbing during the recording. And what's interesting is to think, well, what's actually going on? So we have a small need for glucose all the time because various cells in the body do need glucose. The brain is one of them. We don't need much, but we're so cleverly designed that your body can actually liquidate protein and fat and produce sugar all for itself where there was none. So that somebody that's not eating sugar can, in certain circumstances, manufacture sugar. So an example of this might be, for instance, if you're ill, maybe people are not eating for a few days. So how does the body care for itself, and it does this by producing sugar from fat and protein in a state if you're stressed either physically or mentally. So there are hormones will do this, and so there's a clear link between high levels of stress and blood glucose that may go up that I know exists in me. I remember one patient years ago who had, I couldn't understand because his blood glucose was sky high, and actually we needed insulin for a short period of time. But it turned out he was planning his daughter's wedding, and he was so stressed by this, and he said, "Trust me, Dr. Unwin, when this wedding is over, my blood glucose will be normal." And it was, and he came off insulin again. It was just the stress of the wedding. So stress is a potential cause of a higher glucose, not explained by somebody having too much sugar in their diet. Carbohydrates are a source of glucose. Either obvious glucose in terms of things that taste sweet, so that if you have diabetes, it's pretty obvious you shouldn't be having biscuits or sugar in your tea and coffee or ice creams or other desserts. But it also represents things that don't taste sweet, like breakfast cereals or muesli or rice or potato or bread, because these starchy foods break down into surprising amounts of glucose. Years ago, I was asked by one of my partners in the practice if I could try and explain how this is to ordinary people, because she found my explanations were too complicated to understand. So she said, "Go away and come back when you can explain this to one of our ordinary patients." So I came up with a thing called the teaspoon of sugar equivalent. So what I've done is looked at 800 different carbohydrate-like foods and calculated how many teaspoons of sugar would you have to consume to equal a portion of each food in terms of its effect on your blood glucose. So to give you some examples, a small slice of brown bread would affect your blood glucose to the same extent as 3 teaspoons of sugar. So it wouldn't matter whether you had 3 teaspoons of sugar or a small slice of brown bread in terms of its effect on your blood glucose. Some more examples would be a small bowl of rice, 150 grams of boiled rice, will affect your blood glucose to the same extent as 9 or 10 teaspoons of sugar. So that really would make you think twice about having a lot of rice if you had type 2 diabetes. It's not a great food because it digests down into surprising amounts of glucose. A baked potato is another good example. People often think a baked potato is a healthy option, but it's starch, so it breaks down into, depending on the size of the potato, breaks down into about 8 teaspoons of sugar. Or a bowl of cornflakes, even without the sugar on, will break down into 8, or the equivalent of 8 teaspoons of sugar. So you can see now that if you had type 2 diabetes, or if you had pre-diabetes, or if you had a family history of diabetes or were worried about it, these foods with starchy carbs don't make great food choices, because you could eat other things. You could maybe have, for your breakfast, instead of cereals, you could have scrambled egg and smoked salmon. You could have plain yogurt with some blueberries. This would affect your blood glucose to a much less extent than starchy carbs. Your blood glucose goes up, but then insulin piles in and the glucose is rapidly got rid of, pushed into your belly fat, into your muscles and into your liver, and then you're hungry again. And which of us have come home from a Chinese banquet and you could just really fancy a kebab, or you want something else from the fridge? And that is this phenomenon which of carbohydrates seem to drive appetite.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it drives appetite because they break down into glucose, the blood glucose goes up, Insulin piles in, drives the blood glucose low, and you're hungry, and you go back to the cookie jar. And you could see how you'd end up on an endless cycle and wake up weighing 20 stone. And in fact, for years, that's how I was. I was constantly hungry, and my personal problem was biscuits. And I kept biscuits in the drawer of the consulting room, and if I was stressed, I'd have maybe 3 or 4 biscuits, but that would go on all day long. And I was using the biscuits as a kind of crutch, because I don't know, it seemed to help me, but I was actually addicted to them. And you just end up with a big belly and hungry all the time, and you don't ever count those biscuits. If somebody had said, did I eat many biscuits, I'd have said a few, but actually it was packets and packets and packets. Right, fruit and vegetables. This is one of my pet things, because we talk about the 5 a day, fruit and vegetables being healthy. The trap, though, is that are fruit and vegetables all the same? They're clearly not. So in my book, in terms of what they do to your blood glucose, they vary a lot. So that, you know, potato, a bowl of mashed potato is going to affect your blood glucose to the same extent as maybe 8 or 9 teaspoons of sugar. So that would affect your blood glucose quite differently from broccoli. Same as fruit. If you took a banana, a ripe banana will put your blood glucose up to the same extent as about 5 teaspoons of sugar. That just makes you hungry. And it isn't as good for you as perhaps some blueberries or strawberries, which only put up your blood glucose a little. So I think when we talk about fruit and veg, it actually annoys me that we lump them together. I think we should talk about green veg. I really think that's healthy. And I think some of the tropical fruits particularly need eating with care because of the amount of sugar they contain. And another trap is juicing. If you eat whole fruit, that's one thing. But if you blend them, all of the sugar in those fruit is available really fast and comes crashing into your bloodstream, causing a spike. So that a fruit smoothie is not an innocent thing in my book. I would always have whole fruit, and I would tend to have berries, really, blueberries, strawberries, raspberries. I'm a great fan of green veg, but I'm not such a great fan of starchy things like potatoes. This all depends on what you're hoping to achieve and where you are health-wise already, and whether you're on medications for diabetes and other things. So I could never give specific advice, but there's some good general thoughts. My first question for people is, well, where are you on the sugar spectrum already? If you're having lots and lots of sugar in tea and coffee all day and eating biscuits, well, there's some low-hanging fruit there. Why not cut the sugar out of your tea and coffee and stop the biscuits and see, does that achieve what you're hoping to achieve? Is it going to be weight loss, improvement in diabetes, or whatever? But then again, there's many people who tell me, well, I have actually cut back on sugar. I have diabetes. I know not to eat sugar. So for these people, then they're having to look at starchy carbs. And so it's a good idea to experiment with yourself and see. That's how I began. I experimented by cutting back on starchy carbs and then thought, well, how do I feel? What I noticed was I didn't need as much sleep, I had more energy, and I was delighted to get rid of my belly and I could run faster. And that encouraged me to notice days on which my performance was better. And by trial and error, I discovered that actually eating really even small amounts of carbs make me lethargic and I don't perform as well. So my personal journey has been one of reasonably severely cutting out sugar. But I like the idea of a spectrum. Where are you on the sugar spectrum? Are you having lots or not very much? What's your relationship with carbs? Are you able to just have a small amount? Can you do moderation? Many people can't. I've seen 2 people in the last week, one of whom was crying, telling me that she eats a large amount of bread on a regular basis. So for her to eat bread moderately is not possible. Her only answer is to cut it out completely. So we've got the idea of where are you on the sugar spectrum? How much sugar are you taking in? What would be a small step towards having less? What's your relationship with these various starchy carbs? Can you manage moderation? Be honest if you can't. And then the third factor is why you're doing this. So important. If you have type 2 diabetes, then you've got quite a problem with sugar right away. If you're just hoping to get rid of belly fat and you're in generally good health, well, maybe you don't need to cut back as much. So there's all sorts of different ways that people might do this and very individual journeys. A few tips. One of them is experiment with turning the white stuff green on your plate. So that instead of rice, well, why don't you put your curry sauce over a load of different green veg? Instead of spaghetti bolognese, the tasty bit is the bolognese sauce. It's not particularly the spaghetti. Sorry, why don't you just put the sauce on top of green veg? Another simple tip is breakfast cereals. Well, why not have bacon and egg? Why not have scrambled egg with smoked salmon? Why not have full fat plain yogurt with a few berries in? So those are simple things people could do to notch them, move them along the sugar spectrum. It is a bit complicated, and that is because people do it for very many different reasons. And I think you have to begin with, why are you doing this? And then how extreme are you going to be? And are you on any medications? And did you ought to discuss it with your own doctor? To run the vital parts of your body, you do need 130 grams of glucose in a day. The question is, does it have to come from dietary carbohydrate? And the answer to that is no. Because if you think about it, people have fasted as a religious thing, or they've been in prison, or they've gone on hunger strike, and they don't die. So somehow or other, we managed to produce this 130 grams of glucose, whether you eat carbs or you don't. And this is part of the genius of how we've been designed, that it's mainly the liver can actually generate exactly as much glucose as we need to run the brain from our fat and protein reserves. And so that somebody going on hunger strike for a month does not die, and they're actually fine. And it also explains how I can run 5 miles having not eaten anything at all for a couple of days, because I can manufacture sugar to keep my brain going. Another important point is that actually most of the cells in the body are potentially dual fuel. So actually, as a human being, we are a dual fuel engine. We can actually run on fat or glucose. What's interesting is if you have much glucose in your diet, the fat becomes inaccessible and you can't burn fat. It's due to one of the actions of the hormone insulin. And that explains why are people with obesity ever hungry? Because actually they've got massive stores of energy right there. And yet I know when I was younger and fatter, I was hungry the whole time. And yet I had stones of reserves of fat. So why was I hungry? And I think it's because I was snacking continually on biscuits. So my insulin levels were high and I couldn't access that fat. But people who go, this is called the ketogenic diet. So people who go on very low carb diets actually burn fat. And probably I'm on a very low carb diet. I can run on fat. And I can do, as I say, either in a fasting state, or I can be on very low carb diet and I can still run. So actually, in terms of dietary, the dietary need for carbohydrate is almost certainly zero. Although we do have a need for glucose, but that can be met by other sources in the diet, not carbohydrate. In my practice, a lot of the carbohydrates are replaced by leafy green vegetables or nuts. And these themselves provide quite enough fiber, and that most people find that their bowels, if that's what we're worried about, work perfectly well with all the green veg. Green veg, of course, bring other advantages as well as fibre because of the vitamins that are in there. In my practice on the whole, we're using stir fries, we're doing a lot of green leafy veg, and I eat a lot of almonds and pecans and walnuts, which supply fibre. So for me, why would I have a source of fibre that brings with it a pile of sugar in terms of the starchy carbs and whole grain breads, when I can get exactly the amount of fibre that I need from green veg and nuts? The commonest one is being very thirsty all the time, and with that, weeing, where you start passing urine weirdly often and large quantities. And interestingly, this is caused by the high levels of glucose in your blood. So that high level of glucose starts spilling out through the kidneys into your urine and drags with it water. So that somebody with type 2 diabetes suddenly finds they're weeing lots, large quantities. So that would be the commonest thing that somebody with type 2 diabetes might notice. Also, they might notice they're a bit sleepy. Mind you, most of us feel sleepy, don't we, some of the time? But they just notice they're very, very sleepy. Personally, it's just interesting. I noticed that I needed to have a little lunchtime nap, so that before I could face the afternoon surgery in the practice, I used to lie down on my couch, just press the do not disturb button on the phone, pull the curtain around. I used to have a 20 minutes nap on the couch every day before I could face an afternoon surgery, because I found I was so sleepy I could almost nod off in front of the patients. So that's something that you would worry about a bit, and it may mean you've got diabetes. Over time, you know, if you don't do something about the diabetes, well, other things start to happen. For many people, obviously, obesity might be part of this and the problems of obesity. But because of the worsening state of the small blood vessels, which can be a consequence of a high blood glucose over time, that's why we worry about vision, because it's one of the commonest causes of blindness now is diabetes. In a similar way, the circulation to your kidneys can be affected so that the kidneys don't work as well. And one of the commonest causes we've got of renal failure now is diabetes. Also, the circulation to the skin can also be affected. And added to this is another problem where people get numb extremities. They can't feel their feet. And that's because the circulation to the long nerves going down your legs doesn't work as well, and they get a thing called peripheral neuropathy where they can't feel their feet. So you have a dangerous combination of poorer circulation to the skin, poorer circulation to the nerves of the feet so you can't feel where your feet are, and you start getting quite bad leg ulcers, and also poor circulation to your toes. And this leads to another epidemic, a tragic epidemic, of I've got patients who have, first of all, toes and then feet, and then even their lower leg might be amputated, particularly for people who have type 2 diabetes and smoking. That's a really dangerous combination. So it's a very depressing subject, really. The message of hope I've got is I don't accept this happens. I've seen many patients who put their diabetes into remission by cutting on starchy carbs and improving their diabetic control, and then feeling so much better and taking control. So it doesn't have to be this depressing story, although it will be if we don't do something about it. Until 5 years ago, somebody presenting with type 2 diabetes, what I was doing, and normally the first line drug I used was metformin. So I would, as I say, I did mention something about sugar, but just not very much. And I routinely, without waiting, was starting them on metformin. And one of the reasons I'm sorry about that now is actually 20% of all of the people started on metformin get loose motions as a side effect. So those poor people have abdominal bloating and loose motions when there are other ways that maybe they didn't need to go on the metformin in the first place. But certainly I was using metformin, I still do, but only after I've properly looked at lifestyle medicine first. Then after metformin, if people's diabetes continues to deteriorate, there are enormous numbers of drugs that we use. Insulin is one of the least, the last ones we would add. And partly because as a side effect, it tends to make you rather fatter. And there are concerns about whether it increases heart disease. So insulin is the last one. There's many other drugs we use in between. What's interesting is how rarely I actually need those drugs in clinical practice now, given that I'm really cutting back on the sources of glucose. Because let's think about it, how do the drugs work? They're actually working one way or another to get rid of a glucose burden. So they have to push that glucose somewhere, so maybe it's more logical not to take the glucose in the first place. Why are we dealing with it afterwards? One of the new drugs causes you to wee the sugar out. It's a powerful drug and it actually causes you to have all the sugar go out in your urine. And as a side effect, you're more vulnerable to urinary tract infections because your urine's so sugary. But what a bonkers idea, in a way. Why are we getting rid of the problem by causing you to wee it out, when really, perhaps you could just not eat the sugar in the first place? I think at least we should discuss this with patients. It's growing. It's a new exciting thing, really. I find a lot of young doctors are beginning to take this up, where we're looking at all aspects of lifestyle, which includes obviously diet, and for me a low carb diet, but also exercise, also how you're sleeping. Do you enjoy your life? All sorts of different things. And those aspects of lifestyle really impact on health, particularly impact on chronic disease. It's so refreshing to think about that with patients instead of drugs. So we've got an idea of lifestyle medication instead of lifelong medication. And there was a wonderful lifestyle medicine conference in Leeds recently. We were expecting 30 doctors, and at 250 we had to stop people from booking, and there was a waiting list of young doctors wanting to come. I was the oldest person in the room. They were all young doctors. They were dead keen, and each of them had paid £200 to come and given up a Saturday, fascinated by this idea of helping patients to understand lifestyle as a route to better health. And if you can think about it from a doctor's point of view, this is cheerful medicine. And it helps with patient resilience, but it helps with doctor resilience as well, because it isn't fun. It's not fun to see your patients get sicker and keep adding in drugs over years. That's what I very, very nearly retired 5 years ago, because it is so depressing to watch your patients as they get older, and you add a drug and then they deteriorate a bit more, and then you add another drug, and then you up the dose, and then they get side effects, and then you end up giving them drugs for the side effects. Very depressing. And if you contrast that with the idea of my patients now weighing so much less, losing weight, taking exercise, they're coming to me with stories of success of what they've done. Photos of this is me in my new outfit. You know, these are the holidays I've done. I've started cycling, I've started yoga. It's a whole different paradigm of medicine, really. Use drugs by all means. They're sometimes absolutely necessary, but I was using them far too easily. And lifestyle medicine as a choice for patients, something you can offer them, is really interesting. At its core is the idea of what a doctor believes works. And all of my training and so much of the influences that have been brought to bear upon me for the first 25 years were pharmaceutically based, where the evidence I read about, the evidence I saw, the people I talked to, all were talking about this drug or that drug or the latest drug. And I didn't personally, I hadn't really seen very many examples of lifestyle medicine making a difference. And then one patient changed my life, one patient. And this patient, what had happened was I knew from the computer system that she wasn't taking her metformin, the first-line drug for her diabetes. And I wrote to her saying I had concerns and would she come and see me? Because I thought, why is she not cashing in the prescriptions? And this wonderful woman, when she came in, I didn't recognize her. She'd lost 3 stone in weight. She looked fabulous. She looked so different. I actually tried to send her out of the consulting room because I thought she wasn't Mrs. Jones. So I said, I'm so sorry, I'm expecting Mrs. Jones. Would you mind waiting in the waiting room? And she said, I am Mrs. Jones. She changed her life. When we did the blood test, she'd put her diabetes into remission. So she looked fabulous, she felt fabulous, she was saving me money. And I began to believe. And then when I myself went on the low carb diet and felt better, and then the first 20 patients, the first 30 patients, and the first 50, and then the first 100 did well, I believed in this as an approach. And I believed in it more than what I had seen happen from drugs for all those years. And I began to see that so much of the influences that I had experienced had been bigging up the effect and benefit of medication, which definitely has a part, but I had missed what I should have been doing first, which is giving patients the chance to cure themselves first. And I think for many other doctors, they're tired. You've only got 10-minute appointments. We can't get locums. There aren't enough young doctors. General practice is a very hard thing to do. It's very, very tiring. It's 12-hour days. So, you know, you're not always delighted when some other doctor comes up with this wonderful idea for you to work harder and do more stuff, because you're tired. And it is hard unless you've really seen it work. But once people have seen it work, and there are hundreds and hundreds of doctors interested in this approach now. When they see it working and they see the grateful patients, I'm thanked every day. Every day I'm thanked by my patients. I wasn't thanked for metformin. Nobody thanked me for beta blockers or insulin. But I am thanked genuinely, shaken by the hand by people who say thank you. And it feels like brilliant medicine. And that's why I'm not retired 5 years on. I'm a great fan of exercise. I'm a runner myself. I've run for years now. I think one of the things that requires delicacy as a doctor is, how do you advise people? How do we get people to take more exercise? And so I used to be a great one for telling people to go to the gym, but really that's the wrong way to do it. Maybe the gym isn't the best thing for them. A better question is, if I can tell you that exercise would really help, what exercise might you do? What might you choose? And then I've just asked a question, and you can't say yes and no. You have to think, what exercise might I do? And that exercise doesn't have to mean Lycra. You know, it doesn't. And because many of my patients, in fact, so my average patient with type 2 diabetes weighs about 100 kilos and they're about 60 years old. That isn't somebody that's going to go to the gym and, you know, they're not going to start lifting weights because they're a bit ashamed. So for them, why not brisk walking? Why not climb upstairs, go up and downstairs? For each of us, there's a form of exercise that might suit us the best. You might think table tennis is fun, or badminton, or as I say, just brisk walking, or for some people, just walking. I suppose the question is, how fit are you now? And what might you do to become a little bit fitter? And so very often I can get people started, and then I'd say to them, just notice First of all, how did you feel before you went for exercise, which is, I don't fancy going. And then when you get back, most of us think, well, actually, it wasn't as bad as I thought and I feel better. I think that really encourages people to take exercise. Other things that we can do for diabetes, all sorts of things are wrong with our lives. So some people are in unhappy relationships or difficult jobs, or, you know, we're all coping with things. And how might you lead a better life? So many people don't have any time for themselves. They don't do anything at all in an active way for themselves. And I say to patients, well, what might be fun? What might you do to have a better life and be less stressed? I get all sorts of interesting answers. They might start ballroom dancing. They might start night school. They might start singing in a choir. All sorts of things that help you with stress and improve your quality of life may well improve your diabetes. Another link is actually a lot of people overeat because of stress. So that, I think for me, I was overeating biscuits in a major way because I found medicine so stressful. So I was eating biscuits out of the desk drawer to cope with my anxiety about coping with a particular patient. And I missed the fact that eating biscuits was not helping me or my patients. And it had become a sort of an addiction. So that sometimes, maybe if you could find a way to improve your life, maybe you wouldn't have as many of those foods that you know are not good for you. You might find it easier to do without chocolate, or easier to do without alcohol, or easier to do without smoking. And actually that brings me to another subject, doesn't it? So a lot of people drink far more alcohol than is good for them, and that doesn't help diabetes at all. It's very counterproductive, and linked to that is smoking. Most of the people with diabetes that I have seen with amputations have also been smokers as well. So for my patients, if they have diabetes and they smoke, it's a high priority for me to try and help them get off cigarettes. So it's really, diet is core to it, but there are many other things that may be important, to other things to do with lifestyle. Exercise, smoking, drinking, stress, and just your quality of life probably covers most things. We're all governed in the health service by what are called NICE guidelines. So the national NICE guidelines for type 2 diabetes say that the patient voice is important and must be heard, and that care should be individualized and explained to patients. So that really doctors and all healthcare professionals, we have a duty to discuss pros and cons with our patients, so that it's quite possible for patients to try and negotiate with a doctor, where you can say, you know, you've offered me the medication and I'm grateful, but would there be a possibility of me trying this low carb diet for 3 months just to see? And, you know, I'm happy to cooperate with blood tests or whatever you say. I know you're the doctor. And if it doesn't work, well, I'll have to think about your advice on the drugs. But would you be open to me trying my best with lifestyle for 3 months? And I think that forms a good compromise between doctor and patient, even if the doctor wasn't so sure. Most doctors are open to negotiation with patients. We want happy patients at the end of the day. Doctors have learned to compromise, and if that's what the patient particularly asks for. Of course, in some cases, the doctor may know something specific that means I want to give this drug because. So it's very reasonable for a patient to say, have you got any particular reasons that you think I should take this drug? And are there alternatives for me, because I'm really interested in avoiding long-term medication, if that's possible. And in that way, I think you can keep it polite, and most patients would come away having had a useful conversation. If we go to the type 2 diabetes NICE guidelines, it's absolutely enshrined in the guidelines that we should be advising low glycemic index sources of carbohydrate in the diet. And really, to a layman, that means a lower carb diet. So it's justifiable to say that a low carb diet is completely reasonable, because in its way it's already there in the NICE guidelines. And this has been reflected recently so in Scotland they have it's called the SCAN guidelines, and there they specifically mention low carb as desirable. I think things are changing in the UK now. There's increasing amounts of talk about sugars as being harmful and reducing sugar. And really, if you're reducing sugar, you're only a step away from reducing refined carbohydrates that digest down into sugar. So I'm optimistic that a low carb choice or an alternative is becoming more mainstream almost by the day in terms of the number of people who are doing it, and I know hundreds of doctors who are completely happy with it. And there's a worldwide trend behind this. So it is becoming more mainstream, and I believe that NICE guidelines currently covers doctors like me who are encouraging our patients to give up sugar and refined carbohydrates. Doctors are happiest with treatments they're familiar with and that they've worked with. So it's quite hard as an old doctor like me to take up a completely new approach and experiment with it. And many other doctors like me are tired, and then here we have this new way of doing it. And it takes energy and requires patience. And if you haven't seen it personally work, these doctors, I suppose I can understand them being cautious because they're not sure. I think many doctors like me probably didn't know that it advises, number one, individualizing care, and number two, that we should promote low glycemic index source of carbohydrate. I think a lot of doctors are not aware of what's in the guidelines, and I don't blame them because I wasn't either. On top of which, they are familiar with drugs. They see drugs as their most important tool, and in many conditions drugs are very important. But I think we've missed a trick, because in my practice really drugs are certainly not first line and don't need to be. So I've worked in the same general practice now since 1985. So I've cared for the same population of people, 9,000 people in all that time. And I've observed all sorts of changes in that time, some of which have led to my passion for type 2 diabetes and obesity. So that when I began in the practice, this was 1985, we had 57 people with type 2 diabetes because we happened to do a survey of them on the year I joined the practice. Of those 57, not a single one was under the age of 50, and many of them were over 70. Wind on 30 years, I've now got 475 people with type 2 diabetes in the same population of 9,000 people. Something dreadful has happened to the population that I look after. That's like an 8-fold increase in diabetes. It's unbelievable. And I never thought I'd see such a thing. But there's been another epidemic gone along with it, and that's an epidemic of obesity. The appearance of the people in my waiting room has totally changed. There's so many heavy people, even struggling to walk, just because they're heavy. Now I didn't have people like that 30 years ago. They didn't exist. There were not the heavy people there are now, whole families, and some of them very young. along with that, I've noticed that the people with type 2 diabetes, so there are 8-fold more of them, they're also decades younger. So many of them now are starting with type 2 diabetes in their 30s. And this is really serious and very worrying, because that diabetes has got so much longer to do damage. I think, if you're 75 and you start with type 2 diabetes, it's of only moderate importance because of the length of time that diabetes has to do damage. But what is going to happen to these young people in the next decades? What is going to happen to their eyes and their kidneys and their feet? It's really serious. And this epidemic, it makes me so mad, really. I don't think we should accept it. It's clear to me that it can't be genetic. You can't have a genetic change in 30 years. It's environmental. And I believe it's what people are eating. I think they're snacking, they're having sugary drinks, they're eating cakes, chocolates, energy bars, all sorts of stuff. And they're sick, they're ill, they don't look well, and they're not well. And I really worry that when my generation of older doctors has died out, nobody will remember that there was a world without diabetes. As a young person, I didn't know anybody with diabetes. There was nobody in my family, I never met anybody, I didn't know it existed. And now, which of us can say we don't know anybody with diabetes? The world has changed. I think it's vital that we do not accept this epidemic and that we fight it before it becomes accepted, because it's a poor reality to accept. It's a dreadful prison. When I think, I have children who are too fat to run. They can't run. They're laughed at, their lives so hard. Whole families imprisoned with obesity. Obesity, it's not a lifestyle choice. They don't choose to be heavy. It's horrible for them. But we live in an obesogenic environment. We're surrounded by snacks. We're surrounded by the idea that we should treat ourselves and we should eat this and buy this just a snack. I think many of us are addicted to carbs and we cannot manage moderation. And that's one of the main reasons I face an epidemic of obesity, but it's a cruel epidemic and it should be fought. We've all got a part we could play in that battle. I think every time a takeaway shop is allowed to open up near a school, we've done a small wrong thing in the world. Every time we allow a garage to sell chocolate and snacks, we've done another small wrong thing. I think there are many of these things that need fighting at a political level, at a planning level, at a family level, and at the level of the health service. So many things, but we all must fight it. I think my own journey matches this pretty well. So for 25 years, I gave what I thought was good advice. And I didn't realize that advice, hardly anybody lost weight. And I relied really heavily on prescribing drugs to help patients. So I think I was making an error in that I didn't really engage and think about lifestyle medicine enough. I started lifelong medication too early. And I made the mistake of not involving my patients in the decision making. So that I used to start them on drugs, but I wasn't honest. I didn't say that you have a choice, would you like to try lifestyle medicine first? I didn't say we need to really think about weight loss because that could make a big difference. I was dishonest too because I didn't tell them that I was starting lifelong medication. So I used to say, well, just start you on a little bit of this. And that was wrong because I was actually starting a major drug for life. And I wasn't telling them that, and I didn't give them the option to change their life. And I find that now I'm saying to patients, right, your blood tests have shown you have type 2 diabetes. We've got a choice. If you could really engage with losing weight and cutting back on sugar, maybe I don't have to use the drugs. But equally, I'm not a bully, so if you're not interested in lifestyle medicine, if that's not your thing, we could start the drugs now. And what's really interesting, in 5 years, not one patient has turned me down with my offer. Every one of them has taken the challenge and said, I'll do it. I will lose weight and I'll cut back on the sugar, I'll cut back on the starchy carbs. And that's a win-win situation because the patients are so proud of themselves. But at the end of the day, I'm saving a load of money because my practice is spending about £40,000 every year less on drugs for diabetes alone because of all of these small decisions where patients are saying, I don't want the drugs, or people I'm managing to get off drugs. So I regret the 25 years where I didn't really talk about lifestyle medicine with my patients. I didn't tell them the big difference that weight loss could have made, because I find if you tell patients that losing weight will make a difference, they will do it. I think the other thing I did wrong was I think if I'm being honest, I'd actually forgotten that starch breaks down into sugar. I didn't mention it. If you'd quizzed me, I knew it. I learned it at medical school, but I wasn't linking the physiology of starch breaking down into sugar, and the whole thing of diabetes begins with, I didn't even discuss it. I was dismissive. The best I ever did was say, of course you know to give up sugar, and then say, yes, I'll do that. I never went into the detail. And I'm so sorry about that now, because I've learned I can do a much better job by talking about the physiology and explaining to patients why they've got the problem, and then involving them in the solution, which is, for most people, cut back on all sources of sugar, which includes refined carbohydrates. The Royal College itself, the Royal College of General Practitioners, is becoming far more interested in lifestyle medicine. And I think it's highly relevant that they published for every GP in the country the guide to low glycemic index diets that I wrote for them. So that's got to be a sign of hope when the college publishes that, and the feedback on that e-learning module, and it's available to all 52,000 GPs in the country, and it's free, is a sign of, if doctors are not sure how to do this approach, there's somewhere to go and find out. And that I hope over time, as doctors meet patients who have done it, they'll gain confidence. And there's massive interest. My emails every day, I'm asked by doctors, can you help me in terms of how I am to do this in practice? We all think about our hearts as really important, but I actually wonder if the liver is at least as important. And my interest was sparked because of the thousands of people in my practice who had abnormal liver function. I find about 1/3 of all of the people in my practice have abnormal liver function. And I'm so fascinated as to why should that be? And then I came across a really brilliant paper a few years ago in the British Medical Journal, and it pointed out that 20% of everybody in the developed world has a thing called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So this is where people's liver is filling with fat, and not because they drink, and it's causing abnormal liver function. The worry is it's linked to cancer of the liver, but more commonly, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease changes your blood fats and has an influence on heart disease. So this idea of our livers filling with fat, I think, is very important, and I'm fascinated as to why is it. My own feeling about it is that insulin is a hormone, and its job is to push glucose out of the bloodstream. And one of the main places that insulin pushes glucose is into the liver. And the only thing that the liver can do with excess glucose is turn it into fat. And that fat is triglyceride, which we can measure with a blood test. And for me, that is one of the main reasons that I'm seeing this epidemic of fatty liver disease. So many patients with enlarged livers and full of fat. You can see it actually on the ultrasound. If you have an ultrasound scan done of the liver, the fat looks shiny and bright. And it's very, very common indeed now. 20% of the whole of the developed world. And yet we don't talk about it very much. I think we don't talk about it very much because there is no drug to sort this out. So it's a sort of quiet threat. And because many doctors are a bit confused as to what you can do about it. The good news, from my point of view, is that I find that patients who cut back on sugar and refined carbs, on the whole in my practice, their liver function improves by at least 30% over several years. And those patients are delighted with the results, and so am I. Professor Roy Taylor of Newcastle University is one of my heroes, and he actually helped get my data published in the very beginning. And he gives a wonderful talk where he says that before the onset of type 2 diabetes, there is a 10-year scream from the liver. And he says there's a silent scream from the liver where people have abnormal liver function, but diabetes hasn't yet occurred. So that fatty liver disease is known to come before diabetes, and that you shouldn't really ignore it because, as Roy says, it's part of the long silent scream from the liver first, and that we should listen. In terms of what people might notice, the commonest one would be a big belly, central obesity. That's somebody whose arms and legs are not that fat, but they've got a big belly. And if that is the case, it would be reasonable to do liver function. I actually believe that a tape measure is a pretty good test. And in a way, if you were worried about having a big belly, I would just try cutting sugar and refined starch and not bother with a blood test, because why not just crack on and sort it out? And certainly just use a tape measure and you'd find your belly would go down. Well, the origin of the beer belly is actually beer supplies very large amounts of carbohydrate, and through the carbohydrate, glucose. So that after a few pints of beer, the blood glucose goes up, the hormone insulin comes on board and pushes that glucose into belly fat, which has two results. One of them is after a few pints of beer, you're murderously hungry, because where's all the blood glucose gone? Because the insulin's driven it away. And the other thing is, over time, you will tend to get middle-age spread or a beer belly. And it was I have a son who's 24, and he's fond of a drink, and he calls beer liquid toast, and that's his way of explaining that beer supplies carbohydrates which break down into glucose and give you a beer belly. So that's my take on the beer belly. I was struck recently by the advertising campaign run by Cancer Research UK. And it was provocative really, because they were asking, what is the second most common cause of cancer after smoking? And then they left a gap while everybody thought. And actually, that is obesity. So obesity is somehow or other the second most common cause of cancer. And when I think about it, I've actually seen in my professional life the incidence of breast cancer and colorectal cancer go up markedly at the same time as obesity is going up. So there seems to be a link between cancer and obesity. Only it's a bit more specific than that. It seems to be that link is particularly with central obesity. These are people with a big belly. They're more vulnerable to specific kinds of cancer. it's a fascinating question as to why that should be. We also know that people with type 2 diabetes are more at risk of cancer as well. So the finger is pointing somewhere towards either sugar or insulin, something like that. Insulin itself is known to act as a kind of growth factor. And this has led to the question of, well, would a low-carb diet help with cancer? We don't actually know the answer to that. But certainly we have these links of association between central obesity, cancer and diabetes, and it's a most fascinating area. The link between diabetes and heart disease is a complex one, but what we do know is that of all of the people who have heart disease, about 70% of them will have abnormal blood glucose. So there's a really clear link between the two. There are links between high blood pressure, diabetes and heart disease, very, very clear links, and linked again to fatty liver disease. And in fact, some people, there is a thing called the metabolic syndrome, which is where scientists are beginning to link high blood pressure, high blood fats, fatty liver disease, ischemic heart disease, and various other things all under one umbrella. And it would seem to be that all of them share a cause where the insulin isn't working properly, so that those people are tending to have high blood glucose. Well, the first thing is, quite apart from diet, is, for heaven's sake, if you're smoking, stop it, because smoking is the single most worrying thing that any of us can do, and there is help to give up smoking with patches, do whatever, because it'll make, smoking takes about 10 years off your life on average. So if you're somebody that's interested in health and you smoke, there's some action you could take right away to make a big difference. Also, are you at all becoming addicted to any sugary type things? Because I didn't know that I was addicted to biscuits. So if there are any dietary things that you think I cannot do without chocolate, or I cannot do without bread, or I couldn't imagine life without rice or whatever, because these are all foods that break down into a lot of sugar, why start dietary habits which are not healthy? Or why let them take root? Because somebody later on, I've got people who cannot give up bread now, cannot give up sugar or chocolate. So as a young person, try and get into healthy eating. And moderation is often talked about. Be honest about what is moderation. So for me, a treat is something you have maybe twice a week, but a treat isn't something you have every day. So if a chocolate bar is turned into something you eat every day, it's no longer a treat, it's becoming something you're addicted to and may come back and haunt you in the end. So be on the lookout for unhealthy traits, drinking too much, eating things in a habit-like way, mindless eating of biscuits or whatever. And along with that, be on the lookout. If you're starting to get heavy, that's an early sign something's going wrong. Take action, don't wait. It's such a tragedy for me to see people who had the early warning signs of whatever. Maybe they were getting heavy or lethargic or whatever. And then I can't help them because their metabolism is so damaged by the end that it's very difficult to help them. Young people can get surprising improvements in health. The fastest results I see are in young people who improve their diet, and they look fabulous really fast and lose a lot of weight. So if you're starting to get heavier, if you're drifting into bad habits, think about the type of health you'd like to have. Think about it in a goal. Are you happy with your appearance? Are you happy with how you look in the mirror? Because if you're not, well, what would be some small steps towards a healthier lifestyle? Think about your health as a precious thing, because I deal all the time with people who didn't think about their health, and then it's very difficult to help them. So think about health as a precious thing. Think about what would be some small steps towards better health for all of us. And I think each of us is probably an expert in ourselves, and we know really what we ought to be doing. And you should ask, well, why am I not doing it then? What is the excuse? You know, are we actually too tired to take exercise? That's weird. And maybe we've sat all day and then we say we're too tired to go to the gym. Challenge the reasons that you're not chasing better health. I've got one or two tips for that. I think always have an open mind to what is the true cause of this patient's illness. So that the true cause of diabetes, what is it for this patient? So I tended to give metformin, which is the first line drug for diabetes, very quickly. But people are not ill with diabetes because their metformin gland has packed up. We need to swim upstream, find out what is the cause of all sorts of illnesses. In just the same way as depression is not a lack of antidepressants. There are many causes of depression, so showing an interest in the actual cause of hypertension, depression, diabetes is very fruitful. And trying to chase up the cause with the patients then respect you for that. And you can become a lot more effective. So it becomes time well spent over the long term because they're not presenting every week with things you're not solving. Another hint, always show interest whenever a patient does something good or solves something for themselves. I'm so depressed when I hear that many patients put their diabetes into remission and the GP never asks how or why. That's weird. I think when patients do good stuff, notice it and ask what they've done. So if they've lost weight, it's so complimentary to notice that they lost weight and say, I'm really interested, how did you do it? And aligned to that, it's a discipline of mine, if I can, to supply sincere compliments to patients in every consultation. So I'm always on the lookout for something to compliment them on. But it has to be something sincere because that improves the quality of your medicine because then you get on better with people. It's not flattery because it's a sincere compliment. And then the final thing is, can you establish with patients shared goals? So if you and your patient want the same thing, that's brilliant medicine. It feels good because you're working together. So that if you can establish that maybe losing weight is a shared goal and work on it together, that works so well. The trick is, how do you get the person who presents with knee pain to admit that the problem is really the size of their belly and that that's what they need to do? But a hint on that. So sometimes as long as you're sympathetic about the knee pain and then you say, you know, I'm just wondering about what might help you. Have you ever thought that losing weight might help with your knee pain? Because if that was something you were interested in, I might have some suggestions to make. And the critical thing is ask permission to discuss weight and then let them give permission. Leave it for a minute and check they do want to talk about it, but most people will. So that you can turn a consultation presumably superficially about knees, but you know yourself, if somebody weighs 20 stone, they will have knee pain and ankle pain and low back pain, and it's actually poor medicine not to help them with their weight. But you mustn't seem judgmental, so you have to be open and do it in this friendly way. But establishing shared goals, very powerful medicine, and cheerful medicine too. It's so fascinating for me to look back about how medicine has changed over the last few years. One of the things that I really love is patients are asking more questions because they looked things up on the internet. When that first happened, I was so grumpy about it because I thought I The great doctor knows best. Who are you to question me? But now I love it when patients look things up, because it's the beginning of discussing pros and cons. And actually, I've learned loads of things off patients. I say, where did you learn that? Show me, because I've learned so much. But you know, the internet, it's democratizing medicine. It's making it fairer and more accessible. And I think it's so important that doctors work with the internet. Because if we don't, if we say we know the best about everything, well, patients are going to wonder whether we're always to be trusted. We must have an open mind. We must at least ask where patients have found out this information and look into it. And it's more and more often I'm getting patients who are saying, you know, I'm not so happy with the idea of antidepressants or this particular drug. Do you think I really have to have it? And then it's my job to justify my decision, and my job to involve the patient into the pros and cons, because every decision has pros and cons. There's no effective treatment that doesn't have what are the side effects, the pros and the cons. And of course, you can always say at the end of the day, well, in my opinion, I'm worried, whatever, but you should at least have a discussion. And I think that's what particularly younger patients are beginning to expect of their doctor, that we should be able to justify our decisions. And I think that's a right thing, and we should welcome it.